Good evening, everybody. And thank you for coming to this panel discussion entitled A Tale of Two Cities, John Burton Harter in New Orleans and Patrick Angus in New York. There are a few things I will say before we actually start, but before I say anything else, I want to acknowledge the role of fate in that we started planning this, and by we I mean my co-advisors on the John Burton Harter Foundation, Alan J. Williams, and our first among equals, Jack Sullivan, who has been on the foundation the longest, and who was inspired to pull this together after listening to an interview that I had done last year with Charles Leslie of the Leslie Lohman Museum. So we started planning as these things go, getting schedules, availability together. And who would have thought that it would turn out to be this discussion of erotic art on June 9th? Need I say more? First of all, I want to thank the amazing staff of Arthur Rogers Gallery, Bradley, Emma, Brenda, and Stephen, who have been incredible on helping us bring this all together. And we are so honored and thrilled to be here in this beautiful gallery, in this magnificent exhibit of Whitfield Lovell's works, an openly gay artist who, I came in on Saturday, I was just blown away by it, as I always am by his works. So thank you to all of you. And Arthur, who has just done an amazing job helping us, sends his regrets. He had a previously scheduled trip. He's in London, but I know that he is here with us in spirit. We also want to thank Jan Bertman, who put together the catalog that you are all encouraged to take home with you, and we do have extra copies if there's anyone else you would like to take one forward to share it with. And we want to thank David S. Rubin, who wrote the insightful and brilliant essay that's in the catalog. I'd now like to introduce our wonderful panelists for this evening. Their complete bios can be found online, so I'm not going to tell you that much about them. You can figure that out, and they will prove their brilliance in the course of this evening.
Or not.
Or not. First, we have to my left Rick Herron, who I had the pleasure of meeting here in New Orleans a few years ago, and then I was asked to join the board 2 years ago of the foundation. About a year ago, when I finally figured out what I was doing, and had come to know Alan, who I'd met a few years ago, and Jack, who I'd known for a long time, even better, and finally got comfortable with speaking up and saying, we need a curator, guys, someone to come in who really knows art speak, and reached out to Rick. We've been talking and working together for almost exactly a year now. Yeah. He has done amazing work. He put together an exhibit featuring Bert Harter's work, and R.E. Roberts' work in an exhibit titled The Messenger that debuted at Spring Break Los Angeles, which is an art fair, which I had not heard about, and we so appreciate you introducing us and Bert to all the people out there. It was a smash. Alan was there. Jack and I didn't get to go because it was right around Mardi Gras, priorities. But we hope that we will participate in it again in the future, led by Rick, who has previously curated exhibits on multiple continents and here in Europe, and we look forward to working with him more in the future. To Rick's left is Edward Joseph, who I just had the pleasure of meeting the other day, but he met Rick and Alan at Spring Break in Los Angeles, We met each other yesterday, but we immediately hit it off. He's fascinating, he's interesting. He is a historian, an artist, a curator. He recently, about a year or so ago, moved from New York to LA and is in the process of opening a gallery that will feature queer GLBTQ plus artists and give representation to those who have been marginalized. It will be work on both a historical and an artistic level. I can't wait for it to be up and running, and we'll look forward to visiting the next time I'm in LA. We'll strongly encourage all of you to do the same. To his left, Greg Nacozy, who is filling in for Esther McGowan, who is the Director of Visual Aids, a very important organization in New York, who had originally agreed to be part of this, and then her schedule changed. When that happened, I reached out to Greg, who I've known through theater circles here in New Orleans for a number of years. And then in March, long story short, there was a production of The Odd Couple in Chalmette, and I got a call 2 days before opening asking if I could fill in for the actor playing Felix Unger, who had dropped out, and it was supposed to open the next day. Now, basically, I am Felix Unger, so it wasn't that much of a stretch. Greg played Oscar. We had a wonderful time, and in the course of that, as we were just chatting, I think, one day, he mentioned that he had, back in the 80s, danced at the Gaiety Theater in New York. And I kind of filed that. So when Esther had to drop out, I suggested to Jack and Alan, well, given Patrick Angus's amazing paintings of the Gaiety Theater, who better than Greg to join us? But it gets better, because I recently found out, by doing a little Googling and then Greg informing me himself, that back in the 80s, he and his late partner, Mark Isaacson, had a gallery in New York in the East Village called the 50/50 Gallery that focused on decorative arts of the 40s and 50s. And after Mark passed, Greg became the executor of the estate, and just 2 years ago, there was an auction of the remaining items from the collection. I would strongly encourage you, when you get home, to Google Greg Nacozy, whose name is there, and Mark Isaacson, and the link to the catalog will come up with some of the most amazing pieces of both art and decorative art that you can imagine. And as for myself, my name is Brian Sands. I first got to know Bert Harter back in 1998 when I was the gallery director of the Lesbian Gay Community Center when it was on North Rampart Street. And we were having an exhibit one Saturday afternoon, and in the course of that, this nice, quiet, unassuming man came up to me and said, I'm an artist. Would you be interested in maybe doing an exhibit of my work here? And we were very open and encouraging to a wide range of people. I said, sure, send me some images, or I think in those days, it was, can I see your, with the slides and whatever. But eventually, we did do, in October of 1998, an exhibit of a dozen of Bert's wonderful works. And we remained friends. And at that point, I was involved with Halloween in New Orleans. I see some familiar faces from that time here today, soliciting items for a silent auction. So each year I would ask Bert, among other artists, if they would contribute something, and he always did, and we remained friends. Along the way, he asked me, invited me to see his new studio and storage facility on Pauline Street, I think the 600 block of Pauline Street in the Bywater. And finally, on April 18th, 2001, and you wonder how I know that because I looked it up on my calendar this afternoon, I was able to go over there. But I had ulterior motives, because in those days, there were social networking sites, but long before there was anything like apps or anything like that. And I wanted someone to take a photo of me shirtless, just shirtless, for one of the apps. I don't even remember which app it was. I have no idea how I would post. I was thinking about this. I honestly do not remember. But unlike asking any of my friends who I was like, oh, Bert, whose work I was familiar with, I figured he's seen enough bodies before, so why not? So I went over there. He showed me the studio and flat files, just amazing. And after a while, I said, Bert, would you mind? And I brought my camera with film along, and he took a few photos. And I did with them whatever I did with them. About 2 months later, I get a call from him saying, can I combine? At that point, I was living in the 900 block of St. Philip, right by Matasses. I have something for you. Sure. Well, he comes over and gives me something, and when I open it, I was thrilled and amazed and surprised to see this portrait that he had done of me, working off one of the photographs that he had taken. I still do not know at all how he got the photo. I do not know if I emailed it to him. I don't know if he took another photo with his camera. I have no idea, but I wanted to bring it, and so that Bert Spirit could be with us today. It's interesting because just a few months ago, our wonderful registrar, and by our I mean the foundation's registrar, Lisa Rolfe in Louisville, had sent me an image of another portrait that he had done of me from one of the other photos, and he had done them right at the same time. But enough about me and us, let's talk about Bert and Patrick Angus. And given that we are dealing with erotic art, one of the first things I think we should talk about, and this is kind of an ongoing conversation, what is the difference between pornography and erotica? And I know it's said when you see it, and there's pornography, violence, but in terms of artwork, take it away.
Well, I think first, I want to thank you guys for having us here. So thank you so much to Arthur Roger Gallery and to the folks at the foundation, Jack and Alan and Brian. It's been a really amazing year getting to know Bert through his letters and through his works. It's been really special, and I think the way that Bert created work is a pretty good points in the direction to answer the question that not many porn directors are going to be looking at classic antiquity and making reference to various decades. You can kind of walk through art history with Bert, and he's creating an ideal world, a fantasy, a utopia that is full of idealized bodies, that they are highly erotic in nature, and I think that he made them for his own pleasure. And if he didn't make them for his own pleasure, I don't know what he made them for, because not many folks got to see them in his own lifetime. So this is someone who was packing his entire life experience into the work that he made, and it looks beautiful, and it looks enticing, and it looks seductive, and it looks slick. But it's also the story of all the travels that he made across the world. It's the culmination of his life experience. And something that's important to, I think, Edward and I both, is that he was a curator and an artist, and it really shows in Bert's work. He's just constantly making allusions to various periods of art history, and generally, unless you're like Bruce LaBruce, you know, there are not that many porn directors super interested in the composition and lineage, right? I think porn is very like of the moment, and that's kind of why interesting, like vintage porn has its kind of own niche and appeal and everything, because we don't make porn like that anymore. There's something really specific when you're looking for like '80s vintage porn, like you know what you're gonna get because we don't have the same politics, we don't have the same desires, bodies are different. So I think porn is for now. It's always for now. And art is always of its time, but Bert was someone who's and Patrick coming from his interest in David Hockney. They're both folks that are just super interested in a lineage, in a history, and connecting to that history.
I would say that, from my understanding, pornography, the difference between pornography and erotic art, is that pornography is specifically utilitarian, right? The point of porn is to get off. Erotic art is art that is made, for, what's the word that I'm looking for? Never mind. I'm not gonna find it, and especially if I try really hard, it's just gone. Erotic art is art that is made for posterity, in that sense. But it creates a visceral reaction, right? When you see erotic art, you have a feeling in your body, and. For myself, I think that's why I find it so important to sort of classify and save and curate this work in perpetuity for the sake of it having been marginalized and disregarded from history for so long. I think that these things that do create those visceral reactions in us need to be saved as opposed to disregarded. And I think that disregarding of these things has a lot to do with the puritanical sort of foundation that America was created in.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
I agree with what I've heard, but I don't think there is a difference between, the difference between pornography and erotic art is just my opinion. Yeah, right. And so there's always going to be people who say, oh, that's art, and other people say, that's crap you're looking at, my grandmother, people, we all know somebody, but it's, so that I just think it goes back to beauty's in the eye of the beholder. We could term it all pornography, and I don't mean any discredit to all the artists who poured hours and hours. I'm calling them artists, friends and lovers and stuff. But, that's just going to be an opinion that there's going to be people who aren't going to accept what we're doing all the time. So.
And here, bring it home right here, right now, we had scheduled a printer for this catalog in Baton Rouge. Right. And what was it, a week or two ago? We found out that they didn't like the images in this book and wouldn't print it.
Right.
And we had to scramble at the last minute and fortunately got someone right here in New Orleans, so we saved on shipping charges. It's a little more expensive, but we think we got a quality book, so the debate on that goes on and on.
Right.
Yes, are you Jan? Jan Bergman, our wonderful lady who put this fabulous catalog together.
Right.
No, to be sure. Sure, thank you. Thank you so much.
I do wonder if it's specifically the male nudity, though.
Yeah,
if
I
they
mean,
might have
that
been
kind of
willing.
euphemism has been used for how long?
Of course.
But now
censor
let's
things.
go kind of delve into Bert and Patrick. At the time, as they were coming to the fore, America was coming out of the era of the 50s, the post-World War II abstract expressionism. And I found this quote in Bert's book last night that I love. I'm a representational painter. I make no apologies for it. If it is generally true that the young rebel against the established order, then it should be remembered that I was raised into a time when abstract expressionism was paramount in the United States, overshadowing the objections of a general public which had no background or philosophical underpinnings to appreciate it. However, by the time I reached college, little old ladies were turning out abstract expressionist art in church basements on Saturday nights.
Of course.
So, of course, you go from there to pop, minimalism, neo-expressionism, conceptualism, and who knows what other isms. But figurative art was outside. And can you address why that might have been, how that would have affected someone like Bert and like Patrick, and the challenges they would have faced in the late 70s, especially the 80s and 90s, because of the style they chose to work in?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, it's not a coincidence that we're sitting here today, I think, because queer figurative art is super, super popular. So these guys, like, it's...
You mean now?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and there's a whole generation of artists that are going to feel such a kinship to this and feel really, really inspired to this. So it is all cyclical, and you really just have to wait a little while, and it will all come back around. Surrealism is super hot right now. But yeah, in that moment, not only minimalism, but then with the post-minimalists, you know, Richard Tuttle's like throwing string on the ground, and Morris is doing, you know, big pieces of felt, and Linda Banglis is doing slime and pores and stuff. And there was just a long period where October magazine was being founded, and it wasn't just queer figurative art. It was, the figure at all. And I don't know if there's so much meaning to it or a lot to explain, but there are definitely fads everywhere, and it does affect the art world, and we can't discount like what the market does to the art world. It is very important, and I wouldn't call post-minimalism exactly a fad. You know, it's a very important stage in art history, but there are artists that just make work that's out of step with their time, and I think the two of them are a couple of them.
Yeah, I would say the rise of the recognition of queer art history now has a lot to do with the rise of identity politics that came about in the early 90s, which, you know, was a product of feminism and queer theory and those things actually being recognized as worth people's time to consider. I don't want to call them fads, but the schools of abstract expressionism, pop, which actually, I mean, has its own queer imagery built in. Warhol. I mean, think about the film Blowjob, which is, you know, just the boy's face is just framed and like he's just getting a blowjob off camera the whole time. And so like it was there, but it was just unrecognized. And it's took up until now with the rise of gay rights, the recognition of trans rights as human rights, things like that, for us to look back into art history and to scavenge, you know, the pieces of what we have left. And I think that's what's so important about Patrick Angus, is because he is, you know, one of hundreds of artists whom we'll never see their work because it was thrown out, because they died poor, you know, of AIDS in New York or San Francisco or LA or anywhere. And there was just nothing, no one would recognize their work as anything but pornography. Yeah, I hope that made some sense. Answer the question.
I'm good.
Well, and the other thing, and I was kind of inspired by David Rubin's brilliant essay in the catalog, not only who made the point of how out in left field figurative artists were, back in the 80s and 90s. But despite that, how important they are, not only as artists, because we can appreciate their art as art per se, but also as documentarians. And it was funny because I emailed a friend of ours, someone you know, and a very nice guy, I'm not being snarky at all, but when I mailed it to him, he immediately emailed me back and like, oh, I recognize the Gaiety Theater. And it's, were it not for someone like him, those scenes wouldn't exist. Right. And if you could touch on that, and the other question I have is, to the best of your knowledge, I don't want to put you on the spot, sure we're focusing on Patrick, who inspired Burt, but are there other figurative queer artists from that time who are now being discovered or rediscovered? Or are they the only two?
I really do want to hear about the Gaiety. Yeah.
Well, I don't know what artists might be doing stuff at the Gaiety. There's a lot of Gaiety art out there, I'd say that, because in the times that I danced there, I posed for several artists.
Really?
And, you know, so which of them are still working or have their work seen and known, I don't know. We didn't keep in touch the same way with social media and Facebook in the 80s. And everybody was dying so quickly, it just compressed time. But,
Well, Greg, then let me ask you this. From the images of Patrick that you've seen, how well did he capture the Gaiety Theater? Is there anything that he included or not included that does not jibe with your recollections?
well, he showed pretty much everything. I mean, maybe not all the details of a private dance, but there's, you know, I mean, there's one, I don't know if it's captioned in here or I saw it online on Visual Aid's website, but the,
And for those of you not familiar with Visual Aids, the organization in New York has for many years now curated artists, particularly those not as well known as, say, a Mapplethorpe, so that their artwork will continue to live on, like Patrick Angus's.
Yeah, and Visual Aids was founded by William Olander, who was a part of the original ACT UP and Grand Fury groups, and was one of the curators at New Museum. And so he was curating some of the first exhibitions about queer art ever. So Visual Aids is a really important resource for curators and artists living with HIV, to really like continue that history. And, you know, the message is always that AIDS is not over. And the Visual Aids really continues that mission, and a lot of the programs that they're doing every year are things that have been happening since the late 80s.
and another thing I was thinking, when you just mentioned Grand Fury, I was friends with some of Grand Fury and involved in ACT UP a little bit, but you know, Grand Fury, some of the things they're most famous for is like silence equals death, the pink triangle. And so that's very I mean, it's not figurative. And so that's what was speaking to people and very powerful, and people still copy that, you know. And my partner, Mark, he was a figurative artist, and he was schooled traditionally and stuff. He wasn't going to show his stuff anywhere, but we were still friends with, you know, the gallery owners and going to summers here and things like that. But they weren't interested in seeing his art even, you know, because that's just not what's getting sold at the time.
And can you please talk about what was the atmosphere like in the East Village at that time? Because I remember, I grew up in New York, and I remember going to the East Village, but in those days, you didn't go much beyond First Avenue, maybe Avenue A. I mean, I don't know if you all saw Rent, but it was like that, and now it's all gentrified. I didn't hang out with Basquiat, I didn't hang out with Keith Haring. I did theater back then, but what was it like as a visual artist? What was the gallery scene like?
I mean, the earlier 80s, so I lived uptown when I first moved to New York from 84 till, I don't know, 88. So a lot of the gallery stuff that had been so popular in East Village and growing was before I actually got there, because even though it was only 70 blocks away, that was a whole world. But when I met Mark and we got involved, he was living on Avenue B, and we had our gallery on Broadway between 10th and 11th, which sometimes I don't even think of as the East Village, because, like, you know, First Avenue behind it is the East Village. But anyway, it was rough, but it was exciting. I keep thinking of the phrase compressed time. Certain things that happened then just are still impacting my life. I mean, I wouldn't, you know, that, and I'm quoting a friend of mine I recently read, there's a website for WillieWare, for Willie Smith, and a friend of mine was partners with Willie. And I never met Willie, but a friend wrote about it when I Google searched. I couldn't remember how you spelled 50-50, if it was the 50 first and then the word, or the word then the 50-50. I wanted to make sure. Anyway, so I Google it and it pulls up this stuff that I had never seen before because someone else had posted something. And it led to the Willie Ware website and his passing and stuff. But it had people from the community just writing memories of Willie Smith. And I knew a few of the people who wrote things, and mentioned, one of them I was mentioned in, not by name, but my partner was mentioned by name, and that we had a three-way. But anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. But the what was your question?
What the atmosphere was like in the East Village. This is getting
atmosphere
more and more
was
interesting.
like
I mean, you know, what Patrick Angus captured here, because there's more than one theater in his pictures just in this catalog. He also did, like, the Bijou, which was down on 4th Street, and the Apollo, and he got around, and we all did. I mean, it was, you know, you're going to die in a second, so why the fuck not, you know? As scared as you could be. And then, you know, you do that and you take care of your friends. And, you know, so anyway, if my friend who mentioned me by way of the three-way in the book, in his blurb on Willie's website, had talked about the time was so compressed. He couldn't believe that he had only known Willie for 6 months and not even that well, you know, just had run into him a couple times and had one conversation. And that kind of thing happened all the time. My partner, Mark, was best friends with Robert Mapplethorpe. And so I'd see Robert, but, you know, they were the friends and stuff like that. And Robert was starting to get sick. But anyway.
No, I know exactly what you mean, because just as you said that, I'd flash back to '88 when a dear friend of mine from high school had just passed. It was a shiva at his parents' apartment. And all of a sudden, the word went around the room that Mapplethorpe is sick. Keith Haring is sick. And that I can remember like yesterday, whereas asked me about 2 weeks ago, I'm like, whatever. So I know exactly what you mean. I did want to go back to the Gaiety Theater for those of you who are not New Yorkers, so that you can get an idea. The Gaiety Theater, is it still around in any way, shape, or form? No, okay, no longer there. But at 46th Street.
It's a Bubba Gump Shrimp Company.
It's what?
It's a Bubba Gump Shrimp Company now.
God. Well, back in the day, it was next to the Luntfontein Theater, and it was above the Howard Johnson that I used to eat at with my mom and my sister when we'd go see a matinee. I went there one time to see the dancers, but I did go there one other time as part of a show called You, that started in the Times Square building on 42nd Street, and you were accompanied by actor or actress who had this ongoing monologue. It was a little on pretentious side, but it was like, what if you did this? Would you do this? And it kind of followed and took you into various venues, one of which was the Gaiety Theater.
What year is this?
About 88.
Ooh, immersive theater.
87,
That's
88, yeah. It was
really
really cool. And then we wound up in a playground on 10th Avenue. But it was definitely there. It definitely caught my eye when I was going to see Sophisticated Ladies, that's for sure. Let me ask you this. In terms of the other artists who were working at the time there, I'm thinking of not only Keith Haring, not only Mapplethorpe, the big names, but someone like Felix Gonzalez Torres, David
Waterovich.
Thank you. His partner, Peter Hujar? Hujar. These are artists who were part of that scene. Who else can you talk about as coming out of that downtown New York scene who are having an impact now?
Well, there's so many, but when you listed those artists, one, I think the importance of photography to this conversation is super important. I don't know if it necessarily is about Bert's confidence or something, but Bert just was really reliant upon the photo reference, and it really shows in his paintings, whereas with Patrick, you get the sense that he's maybe coming from just like a memory of a place. And there's like a really specific perspective to the way he renders his architecture, but his figures are distorted and abstracted, and I think that borrows heavily from Hockney. But the photographers are I think really important to consider alongside this, even though they were painters. To your earlier question, I think that Susan Rothenberg is a kind of a good place to start with somebody making work that was just completely out of left field and not really taken seriously or considered.
What kind of work did she do?
She's the one that made the like blurry outlines of horses.
Right.
So she's married to Bruce Nauman, making the most like conceptual work ever, and she's painting horses, and it was very difficult at that time for the work to be taken seriously. And Mary Heilman and Linda Banglis and the pioneers of that generation making feminist art are certainly alongside this conversation. But to your question just now, I'm really a huge fan of Arthur Russell. So he's a musician who also passed from AIDS, and he was the director of music at the Kitchen, and the Kitchen was developed in Soho in 1974 as a place for filmmakers, and Philip Glass came out of that scene, and Laurie Anderson came out of that scene, and they would really just actually meet in a kitchen in Soho, and it's grown today and is still a really important organization there. But Arthur was this shy Midwestern guy from Iowa, and I feel like there's a little, like maybe he and Patrick could have hung out or been friends, and his work was not known until he passed. You know, it was somebody that was revered by a circle of artists, just like Patrick, but it was really only after his works were released posthumously that now he has this huge fan base, and I'm just so madly connected to his work. It's so it's the work of Keith Haring, the work of Arthur Russell. I think Patrick Angus is a figure like that. You can get to know their work in such a way that you somehow feel like you're friends with them, that you know them so high. And there's a real bitter sadness to the fact that they passed before their time. But yeah, I really think of those guys.
Greg had earlier mentioned the idea of compressed time, and it's really, I mean, the 80s, it was only 10 years, just a decade. So it's really, there's just such a compressed history. So you're asking which artists came out of that time that are having an impact today. Like I said, that's kind of the work of Rick and I is to sort of scavenge those things. For me, my thesis exhibition for my master's was the work of Rick Schuper, who's a friend of mine who was 74 years old that lived through the crisis, and I was able to show vintage prints of his, of friends of his that had died. And photography is my concentration, actually, as a curator and a historian. But so photography has a lot to do with it. There are artists, Stephen Varble, who is just now really being recognized. He has an exhibition that was curated by David Getze, who's an amazing academic specifically on this subject. Augusto Mikado, who is still alive, who's an amazing performer. On that note, Stephen Varble was a performer as well that would do these performances in sort of like drag that he would create out of garbage, and he would go into, banks and break balloons that were filled with blood, protesting a number of things, as you can imagine. But like things like that were happening all over New York in the 80s. And those people are like lost and gone, and a lot of them are just, their works won't be remembered. I can give you a long list of people that I think, but we don't have the time.
One of the reasons I ask, I Googled gay artists earlier today. Certainly many names I recognize, but many, I don't know, maybe 3/4 of them that I would have had to go to the Wikipedia page because they did die young. They didn't have the opportunity to get their work out, or their work might have been out of fashion at the time. I'm kind of doing this a little backwards, but now that we've talked about the next generation, just as Patrick Angus was an influence on John Burton Harter, there was the earlier generation, Paul Cadmus, Charles DeMuth, Jared French, George Tucker. Can you address the influence that you see on Burt and Patrick of the earlier generation of the well-known gay queer artists?
Well, for myself, specifically with Harter, you see Cadmus, and he cites Cadmus as an influence of his. For me, what strikes me in Harter's works is you really see him as a curator, and his work as a curator influencing his work as an artist, because he derives so much of his material from the archives with which he managed, right? There's this beautiful image of this gorgeous blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy called Overalls 1977 that has stuck with me in preparing for this talk. And it was actually sourced from an image of a steamboat worker from the 1930s. Harter derived, so we talked about him using photographs as source material. Not only photographs, but paintings. It would be a really interesting curatorial and historical project actually to look at his works and make their pretty direct connections to other masterworks and things that he had access to in his curatorial career. So, there are a lot of specific artists that, my focus is post-World War II to contemporary art. So I'm not going to try to name them now, but I think even beyond that, there are classical artists and artists from the previous century that had a massive impact on his work that are worth considering. And when looking at his work, thinking about where he got the source material from.
Yeah, I think he was a big nerd. He was a curator at Louisiana State Museum for 35 years or something. So I think Cadmus and George Plattlines and artists of that generation were certainly really formative to it. I think he was very explicit about his influence with Paul Cadmus. But he was so well-traveled, and he was so familiar. They're reaching back to antiquity. Right. And there are plenty of references, so the show that I just did in Los Angeles was called The Messenger, and the theme for the whole fair ties all of the booths together. And for the selection I made, I went into Burt's work and looked at all the places where he was had this bacchanalian feel. And so I selected drawings of a warrior on a chariot and laurel wreaths and bunches of grapes and stuff. And so Burt was really just reaching. You could pick any moment in history from the Renaissance. early American painting. He's really touching all over. So I do think that that 1910 through 40, the stuff that we think about now, like Marsden Hartley and all those classics, I think they definitely loomed large for him, but he was completely voracious in his love for art. And with Angus, this book is a tale of two cities, but it's really about three cities as well. We're have lived in New York a long time, and now we're both in Los Angeles. And Patrick Angus was from California and made a lot of his work about Los Angeles. And LA seems to really figure into the way he thinks about light and the way that he engages architecture. So Angus seems to be really interested in the modern moment, because where Burt will place someone on like a cliffside, he really painted from his imagination so much. Like the figure comes from a photo reference, but the landscape, it's just so utopic and a flight of fantasy. And Angus seems to be really rooted in like modernism forward. And I think that may come from being from LA, just it's such a new city. And I think he really had an eye for that, how to capture it.
One other thing that I wanted to mention, because I did not even go into Patrick Angus, is obviously David Hockney, but also Picasso had a large influence on Patrick Angus, especially if you look at his early drawings. And the Bay Area school of figurative painting, which I am not that familiar with, but it does come from the era of just right before Angus began working, and you see that in his figuration and his use of space and light.
And there's a lot more that we can talk about in terms of David Hockney and other influences, Picasso, in terms of Burt and Patrick, but it's all in David's essay in here. So I don't want to bore you, but I will, not bore you, but when we can discuss other things, but I would strongly encourage you to take this home, get in a comfortable chair and read the essay, because it will enlighten you, and also you'll understand even more all the references that we're making up here. I would just like to say to all of you, because of your involvement in the art world, and then we're going to open up the floor for questions. I know this is a hypothetical, but can you imagine how things might have been different or not for Burt had he been openly gay back in the late 70s and 80s, because he did not really fully come out. He did have friends until his mother passed away, because he came from a conservative family in Louisville. How do you think his, not only life journey, but in terms of his art and his putting his art out there, might have been different?
I don't think it can be overstated. I think Edward and I got along so well when we met each other, because community is so important to both of us, and we talk about it a lot in the contemporary scene now. I mean, we all use that word, and we're also heavily invested in it. And you can see in Burt's work that it has a hermetic quality. It looks like the work of someone that made his work alone. Because there is so much fantasy and so much consistency. So I think one of the most important things that would have happened is experimentation would have happened, like new bodies of work, different ways of making would have happened, because it doesn't feel like he was in conversation about his work. Yeah, so he was in contact with all of history, and he knew it backward and forward. But how we are able to engage with our audience, and how the conversations that you have late at night in a bar or in bed with somebody, all of that really influences where we want to go with our practice. And I think who fucking knows what he would have been interested in? But I just wish that he would have.
And I'm going to, Greg, you mentioned something interesting earlier in terms of when we talked about Patrick doing images of the Gaiety, among other places, which, according to the essay, he would just kind of make mental notes or maybe little scribbles because you couldn't take photos there. You said there were other artists who asked you to pose back then. Were you aware of their work, after they asked you to pose? Did you see it? What was it like? And where did they all work as a group? Because I wouldn't want this to end without following up on that.
To my knowledge, they didn't work as a group, but several photographers would ask you to pose for them. Some of them, it was a part of an erotic experience for them because they wanted to pay you. Or there was this distinction, which I guess was the same as what we were asking before: is it porn or is it art? Well, if I'm an artist, you just compose for me. You don't get paid. It's like, what? My time's money. But there were several artists. I think Jack Hartman. I was familiar with his work because he printed a few books. Hyperion Press. There might be. They did a lot of photo books of some friends and acquaintances that I know. And I can think one or two were painted also. So they were using the photographs and we're going to paint from them. But most of the people I met that I was aware of were photographers. And
you said your partner was friends with Mapplethorpe. Was there then a feeling of community back then?
I think. Yeah, I was telling my partner, Kevin, that the other day that, God, there's only like, when I hit upon that WillyWare website, I was like, and so many people that I knew had written little comments, I was like, this was a small group of people that made a huge impact on the world. It just kind of amazes me. And then the friends of mine that passed without, quote unquote, making the impact, I just recently on Instagram found the AIDS Memorial, and that just has brought me to tears several times. But it's encouraged me to think of ways that we can remember, because it seems to be part of the healing process for me. But seeing this also, sorry, this is what I had the book open to. 2 blowjobs and a full about to happen. But that it's like, oh wow, that's how it was. I didn't answer your question, did I?
I love the way you answer questions. It's like out of Ulysses or James Joyce. On that note, thank you for being such a wonderful audience, and I'd like to now ask you if you have any questions for me or any of our panelists.
Brian, this has been a very interesting conversation. I do have a question for you. In regards to your opening statement that everything regarding art is open to interpretation, I would love for you and maybe one or two of the other panelists to describe, is this more than just record keeping? Was this some type of social commentary of the time? Was he repressed? Was he trying to live out a fantasy? Were these fantasies he was trying to just remember for himself or for the world to try it for themselves?
For Angus or Harter?
For the gentleman who painted these.
That's Angus, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So do you think that this was more than just record keeping? Was it beyond just, capturing a memory? Was this social commentary as well? I'm wondering.
I would argue that with Patrick Angus, there's a very specific kind of humanism. There's like a compassion that you see in his work, in the intimacy that he captures between the figures, that is really apparent for me. I mean, if there was, any kind of negative bias, I've seen work that captures the bitchy queeniness of the scene, and this isn't it. This is men looking for a connection, right, and finding it. And in that way, I do think it is record keeping, but of kind of the better parts of some of the seedier, scenes, and showing how actually not seedy this is, right? So,
Well, it makes me think also the quote that I forget already, was it Quentin Crisp who said that he was the Toulouse-Lautrec of...
It was Robert Patrick, the playwright who wrote Kennedy's Children,
Okay,
has
thank
that
you.
wonderful quote, yes.
But for me, that's what it is. I mean, like, Lautrec did the horrors of Paris, and he's doing some of the horrors of New York. You know, that guy's disinterested, but it's still, you know, it could be record keeping, but I mean, he could have probably, I would have recorded it just in my journal, you know. So I think there's a lot of passion in him doing this. Like, I mean, those are hours and hours and hours of work, because I had friends, I posed for my lover, and there's still not a finished painting, you know. it's like he finished one, he signed it, and scratched it all out. But, you know, so I would say that it's record keeping, you could always call it that, but that there's a lot of, I don't know any friend of mine who is an artist who would say that there wasn't passion involved in why they're doing it. I mean...
And let's not underestimate one other key aspect of this. And Greg referred to it earlier. His time is money. Patrick did not have money to pay models. So that is not the full answer to your question, but it's part of that. He used his memory of going to the theaters to create the scenes. And in the same way with Burt, who was very frugal. There's a moment with my interview with Charles Leslie where I asked him if he hired models. He was like, no, I met somebody. And you know, he was not about paying models. So it's your question has multiple answers. Anyone else?
Well,
I'm sorry.
Just a little bit, that there's just a lot we weren't able to get to this evening. But Burt had money, and he had his means, and he had a career, and he was very much in New Orleans, and he made the work for himself, and he would show it to friends here and there, right? But Patrick Angus, you do not move to New York City to be an artist and then, you know, sketch things or whatever. And the work that Patrick Angus made was desperate to be recognized and wanted to be a part of a community. And he's not making these references to Hockney and Picasso and everything, right? To just be straightforward. This is someone that had a huge ambition, and he was able to sell a few things to a few key people. So you can tell an artist is great when all of the people that like him are also great artists. They recognize something in him. But there wasn't a gallery scene or an audience to broadly support that kind of work. But this was a young person who wanted to make his mark on the world and moved to New York City in order to do it, moved out of LA. So, you know, this is someone who wanted the recognition that he very rightly deserves in this moment. So I hope that his profile will continue to grow.
Brian, I just wanted to mention, because I didn't get to answer the previous question about if Harter was open with his sexuality. And I think he would have been welcome with open arms into a community. Looking at his work, I think immediately of George Quintens, who did work for Physique Pictorial. And they are also these idealized images of, you know, godlike men in very utopic scenes, and often historic scenes, and I see a large connection between the two, and I wonder what would have happened had they been aware of each other's work.
Any other questions? Oh, come on, I know you are a bunch of wise people, and we, as Rick just said, we did not touch on everything.
And does anybody know stuff about Burt?
Yes.
I was wondering if y'all could dive a little bit more into the way that like class and access to resources impacted the two artists kind of living different artistic lives.
Right, because they are at the opposite ends of the spectrum.
I think one of the biggest things to comment there is that this foundation exists to put on this event because he had family money. And we were listening to an oral history earlier today in preparation, and the subject was talking about how everything he would make, Burt, he would make a drawing and then he would go and mat it professionally with archival materials. If he made a drawing, it went in like a glassine little case, and all of the plastics that he used were archival. All of that takes so much money. Like, the reason that we're all able to do this is definitely a class issue. And Patrick's work is sitting at his mom's house in rural Arkansas. And there's definitely something to the fact that Angus struggled financially, and he had a bunch of money and the connections that he had, that we would have a very different story, I think.
I think also it's important for us to acknowledge that, though they were both on opposite sides of the income spectrum, they were both white, right? And we're remembering them now. I think a lot of it might be for that reason, because Patrick's work was saved. I think about all of the Black and trans artists I know that were totally forgotten, that I've only been able to find shreds of their work. So I think it's just acknowledge that privilege is really important here.
And just getting work stored is so difficult, and it's so expensive, and so much work just disappears. Families just throw it away. Then both of these artists made work around the AIDS art generation, and there's just so much of it that is gone because the artist or the person, the collector, would be gone, and their families didn't know what to do with things, and there's so much that's been lost. So the money that Burt had is unique, that he could so perfectly preserve all of this work for us to talk about so many years later.
And just two things to answer, just for your edification, how he got the money. His father was the leading thoracic, am I right? Thoracic surgeon in Louisville. So he had that. But I also think it's important to mention, as I had, that he was frugal. When he was in New York and other cities, he did not stay at a fancy hotel. He stayed at the bathhouse where he was paying $20 a night. And I don't know, I cannot fully figure that out. Oh, you are so bad.
There's a song I know.
You are so bad.
We can figure it out.
Can't figure that out. No idea.
It's a rebel, but I don't think what I meant was that I don't think that there was there's any interviews with him as to why he approached life that way. Moving on. Any other questions? Yes, Leo.
Brian, sort of as a segue, we're so lucky in New Orleans to still have our Gaiety Theater at the corner pocket. And I just want to say, and this, next weekend is their 40th anniversary. So it goes back to this, and they're having a party Friday night from 7 to 9. So this is kind of a segue to say that. Maybe where art's still being made, and there's very few places like that left, and we're lucky to have it.
You are absolutely right, because in so many cities, the bathhouse, I've been waiting for this, the bathhouse where some of Burt's art was exhibited on the corner of Barone and Gallia Street, right by the Rouses, was empty for many years. And then it was a bank, the Hancock Bank, but now it's closed, and I guess not enough people made deposits there as they had back in the day. So here in New Orleans and many other cities, you don't have the gathering places like the Gaiety in New York, like many other bars, clubs, and let's not even talk about lesbian bars, which are non-existent in this town these days, so that this records a very special time and place, and we are lucky that they did so. And on that note, I want to thank you three magnificent panelists. I want to thank all of you. We have a little more time. There's still food and drink and conviviality. So thank you so much for coming out tonight.
Thank you.